Hi, my name is Christoph Bernau from the Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems at UC Santa Cruz, and today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the containers that are commonly available to growers wishing to produce seedlings. And we're going to cover 4 different types of containers today. The polystyrene or styrofoam type containers, a hard plastic or polyethylene container, a lighter weight container, polypropylene containers, and then we'll also touch briefly on the use of wooden flats, a little bit more traditional style of propagation as well. The first thing I'd like to start off with today is just discussing the idea of footprint, the actual bench space that is used by any given container. Of all of the container options that are available on the market today, there's essentially 2 principal footprints that are available. These lightweight polypropylene containers are in what's referred to as the 10-20 format, 10 inches by 20 inches. And then within that, there are many different cell configurations or sizes of the actual space for each individual plant to grow. The other principal format that both the styrofoam type trays as well as the polyethylene trays use is what's referred to as a 13-26, so 13 inches by 26 inches. But again, the cell size can be highly variable depending upon the particular container you choose that meets your needs and the needs of the crops that you're growing. Why is footprint important? Because we want to think about maximizing the use of our bench space. The benches in our greenhouses, our covered and protected growing area, is often some of the most precious ground that we have. And if I have containers of all different shapes and sizes sort of mixed together in my operation, I may very well end up with wasted space, gaps like this and this, where there's no plants growing, and each time I water, I'm going to be delivering water to a zone that's not growing any plants. And in a greenhouse setting where perhaps you're either having to heat or cool the greenhouse, you are heating and cooling the entire greenhouse. And I would like to have plants growing in all of the area that I'm spending time and money and resources to actually grow plants. I'd like to have plants growing there. So whether you choose to go with a 13-26 format, a 10-20 format, or something else that's out on the market, I highly recommend that you think about uniformity and consistency as much as possible, so that you have uniform footprints that then allow you to very effectively use all of your bench space. That's a starting point. So let's jump into some of the advantages and disadvantages of the different materials that are out there, different types that are out there. These 4 trays here, manufactured by the Speedling company. They're made out of polystyrene, as I said, styrofoam. They use the 13-26 format. And typically they have a lifespan, depending on how careful you are with them, they have a lifespan of maybe 5 to 10 years of good utility for you as a grower. One challenge, of course, is that this material is not at all recyclable. But let's focus on some of the benefits of these trays. First of all, by virtue of the cells and the design of the cells, and hopefully you can see this, we'll use this one as a starting point. They have a very conical shape to them. The base of the cell is much narrower than the top of the cell, and that tapered or conical shape allows for water to move very effectively and evenly down through the cells. And then also, the cell terminates entirely in a drainage hole. And that is an ample size hole relative to the shape of the cell, size of the cell. And it allows for these drainage holes here, when they're on a wire mesh bench top or something that's more of an open bench top like what we have right here, this allows for what's sometimes referred to as air pruning. When roots reach the bottom of the cell, and get to the air rather than a solid bench top or a flat bottomed container, they will tend to branch above that point within the root ball and help to fill out your root ball faster. If they hit the bottom of the cell and then there's soil and water on your bench top, roots are going to run out of your tray and make it a little bit more difficult to think about transplanting, because when you go to pull your plants out of the tray, there's going to be roots outside of the cell, and that's going to make it much, much more difficult to remove. We like the the drainage and that design for air pruning. That's really valuable. Styrofoam obviously is a lightweight material too, so that makes it easy for you to handle the containers with your plants in them and move them around in the greenhouse area and out in the field, and that can be very helpful. Many different cell sizes available depending upon the crops that you're growing. As one example, on the smaller size, this is a little bit less than a 1-inch cell. This has got 338 cells per container. This one here, it's got 200 cells per container in about the same bench footprint, that 13 by 26. On the other end of the spectrum, one of their larger cells is a 2-inch cell, so there's only 72 cells per tray. For most folks, for a larger operation, this would really be too big of a transplant, but for smaller operations, this is sometimes really advantageous for things like things in the squash family, all of the cucurbits that if you were considering transplanting those. Sometimes people even do dry farm tomatoes in a cell of this size, sunflowers, other similar crops. Another good thing about these is that they can be, because of that 1326 footprint, there are several different vacuum seeder manufacturers who can produce you seed plates that are custom drilled to fit the exact dimensions of your cells. So that's a nice thing too if you are considering using a vacuum seeder. Some disadvantages to these cells are that this type of tray is that they are very easily damaged. Because the styrofoam is just not that durable, you start to get lots of cells like this where you've got little breaks on the edges and here, and that ultimately gives you less growing area for your seedlings to develop and more debris going off and into the environment as well. Another really important thing is that over time, the interior of these styrofoam cells, they can become what we call etched, where they start to get scraped and scratched up, possibly just from handling, possibly from somebody putting a sharp tool in there to lift a plant out, and then just from the wear and tear from the maybe more coarse materials in your mix. And that etching can then present a little bit of a problem in that you have a site where pathogens could be hosted and or where roots could grow in and cling and grab, making it harder to remove the seedlings out of the cell when you're ready to transplant. And they're a little bit more difficult to clean, as you can kind of see from this one here. And then really, of all of the container options that we have, styrofoam just has the highest environmental footprint in its production processes and in what's left at the end that is not recyclable. That said, we really like them because of the reasons that I listed, in particular because of their lightweight nature and especially because of these larger 2-inch size cells that are useful for some crops that we would grow. Let me transition now, and we're going to talk a little bit about the polyethylene type trays. These are HDPE number 2. They're a recyclable plastic, so we like that. They do indeed come in quite a range of cell sizes. Just to give you a couple of examples here. This is a 162 cell. This is a 242 cell. And then finally here we have a 338 cell, all occupying that same 13 by 26 footprint. We like these because they're recyclable, because they have a much longer useful lifespan. They're virtually indestructible, and really 10 to 15 years of life is not at all unexpected, and possibly longer if you take reasonably good condition of them and store them out of the sunlight when they're not in use. Similar to the Speedling cells, the way that's the styrofoam cells, Speedling is the brand there. Similar to the Speedlings, these have that conical or sort of tapering cell shape, and then they terminate in a drainage hole. So you get good air pruning out of this design as well. Because they are a hard plastic and relatively smooth sides, you get really nice slip. A mature seedling with a good root ball will slip right out of these trays quite readily, which makes transplanting quite a bit easier. So we really like that about them too. They clean easily. Some larger growers even will run them through a mechanical cleaner, kind of almost like a kitchen dishwasher that you would use in a restaurant for sanitizing dishes. We like that just for that ease of use, but that's obviously working on a little bit higher level than what many smaller growers would be doing. In our instance, we simply blast them out with a hose, let them sit in the sun for a couple of days, and then we feel confident that we can reuse them. If we have any concern about any disease carryover from a previous crop, then we would think about a sanitizing solution similar to what you would use in your vegetable cleaning operation on our trays themselves. These ones similarly are well suited to use with a vacuum seeder. The one or two disadvantages about them is simply that because it's a high density plastic, they are much heavier than the styrofoam, much heavier than the polypropylene trays, which I'll get to in just a second. So that just means a little bit more material for you to pick up and carry around in the greenhouse and carry out into the field. Trade-off is the much longer lifespan though, and really that indestructible nature. The other thing that I should mention, in this particular case, these cells, even if they were all the same size, their design is such that they just stack on top of one another. So you need a fair amount of storage space. But some of the hard plastic ones actually have a nesting nature where you can set them down and inside of one another. And that nesting nature means you can store a lot more containers in a much smaller space. So that a little bit about those, and let me move on to our next choice here. So the lightweight plastic or polypropylene containers, we like these for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that they're fairly inexpensive. In comparison, these are usually no more than a couple dollars each, whereas these could be $5, $6 each if you're buying them in bulk, and as much as $10+ if you're buying them individually. The lightweight plastic, though, one of the things that means is that over time they're going to be a little bit more subject to wear and tear. And we typically find the lifespan on these could be as little as 1 year if they're not well cared for, maybe up to 5 years. This plastic is also recyclable as long as it hasn't been too photodegraded by the time you are done with it. So that's a useful feature. One issue with the lightweight kind of flexibleness of these containers is that with some crops you may actually find you need a shallow carrying container, and that's a slight extra expense, but a shallow carrying container to support the crop as you're moving around the greenhouse and in the field. Almost exclusively nestable because these cells fit inside of one another when you're stacking them, so that's really useful. And a huge array of cell sizes in this 1020 footprint. This one right here, to give you an example, this one has 512 cells in it in only 10 by 20 inches on your bench top. So I can obviously grow a lot of seedlings in a very small space, and that can be really advantageous. Though with all of the containers, regardless of the container type, the smaller the cell size, the more plants you grow on a bench top, but also the more you have to be on top of watering because you don't have that much soil volume to retain moisture around your roots. And then the quicker that the plants are going to root out and fill that whole root ball and also start to exhaust the nutrient supply in that space. So in a smaller cell, I just need to be really on top of watering, and I need to be really on top of making sure that I'm going to get my plants out in the ground as soon as they're ready so that they don't start to suffer from either becoming root bound or running out of nutrients in a small container. If I have a bigger cell, then obviously each plant has more resources and can last a little bit longer, but also take a little bit longer until they're actually physically ready for transplant. These lightweight shells, lightweight trays, the plants slip out of them really easily. They're obviously easy to handle and move around in the field because they are so light. There are many off-the-shelf vacuum seeders that work very well with these as well, much like with the others, but even more options for the 10-20 footprint, so that's really helpful. And the other thing, you know, there's just so many options. This, to give you a contrast or another example, this is what's sometimes referred to just as a strip version, and oftentimes growers would grow multiple varieties side by side, and by virtue of these individual strips, it's easy to keep track of your individual varieties. You could also grow alliums in here in very high density, sowing thick rows in a tray like this. That can be really, really valuable as well. So a lot of good advantages and a lot of good utility to this. You just have to be aware that you're not going to be using these trays for as long as something like the hard plastic trays because they're just going to break down and degrade faster. Last thing I want to say, or last type of container I'd like to cover, is these wooden flats. For many people, for a long time, growing plants in a wooden flat was a very common way to go. At this point in time, this is actually relatively uncommon, but I wanted to at least speak on a few of the advantages and disadvantages if this is a system you're using or considering using. First of all, we have renewable resources. We happen to use redwood here in California, but depending on where you live, there may be another rot-resistant type of wood that's relatively inexpensive. Our redwood containers typically live for 5 to 7 years or so, and it's not usually that the wood has rotted away at that point, but more that like the points of attachment where they're nailed together and such starts to degrade and break down. But when they're all said and done, this is basically a recyclable material. It could be a fodder for compost. We could use it for kindling as well. You know, lots of potential uses. Some advantages of this kind of format is in such a big and deep container, I can grow a lot of plants either at high density, like if I sow alliums here, I could have 500 or 600 onions or leeks in a tray like this, easy, and grow them to their transplant size without any competition and without any struggle or challenge. If I'm growing peppers or tomatoes or say a cut flower species, I'm probably only going to have maybe 50 plants in a space like this. And that is a little bit disadvantageous in the sense that I'm not going to have very high plant density on my benches. And I'm going to be using a lot of soil for relatively few plants. But in exchange for that, I can grow a very, very large and robust transplant. This could be particularly useful early in the season when I may not be able to get things out at the perfect timing due to soil conditions and such. If I have a plant that's got access to ample soil resources, I can often let it sit for a couple plus weeks without any setback, without any degradation of plant quality. So that can really work to our advantage. But the tray itself is heavy. I have to pause for a sec. Excuse me. But the tray itself is really quite heavy, and then filled with damp soil, you can imagine this is a very, very heavy container to be toting around. So that can be a little harder on people on the farm team, a little harder on the lower back and so forth. We're also going to consume more soil, and that means there's a materials cost with that as well, of having to either make or purchase more soil to use this type of format. That said, very, very valuable. I just would want to, if I'm going to use wooden flats mixed with some of the others, I'd also want to think about building trays that match the footprint so that, again, I'm maximizing the use of the bench space that I've got. One other sort of just space comparison that I want to make for you is to take a look at two different trays here. We've got a Speedling cell styrofoam tray, 200 cells, 10 by 20 cells in this 1326 footprint. In the exact same footprint, 1326, I've got 242 cells in this same footprint. Why do I have 42 extra plants growing on the same piece of bench space? It's simply that the thickness of the walls between each cell in this rigid plastic is much thinner, and yet it's still a very, very strong container compared to what is possible with the styrofoam. And, you know, again, if you're thinking about trying to maximize your space and the amount of crops that you can grow within that limited space, container like this or any of these lighter weight plastics are going to serve you well in terms of really maximizing the amount of seedlings that you can grow in a narrow space. And finally, I just want to say, whatever container format that you use, one of your other considerations that you're really going to want to be thinking about are, what are the crops that you're growing and how much root run do they actually need? I already mentioned the idea of a smaller cell means more plants on your bench, in your bench space, occupying the same footprint, but smaller isn't always better for all crops. But for most things, we'd like to find sort of that middle range where I can maximize my plant density and simultaneously not squeeze things down so much that I have to be constantly transplanting on a daily basis and constantly thinking about, oh, do I need more water? Do I need more supplemental fertility because my plants are running out? And that's where a lot of small and mid-sized growers land on sort of this 1-inch size cell for a lot of things. Good plant density and good use of your greenhouse resources, but still a transplant that's got a little bit of holding power if I'm not immediately ready to transplant it out when the timing, when the timing as far as the greenhouse seedling is optimal, but maybe it doesn't correspond to the optimal timing in my field conditions. But again, it just depends on the crop. Most things, brassicas, lettuces, and so forth, this would be a large size, but a good size for them. Peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, this would be a small size, but a common size on larger operations. And then you think about jumping up into a bigger cell, like a 1.5-inch cell, if your timing is not going to be as optimal as you might think. The main thing you don't want to do is put really big plants like a cucumber, say, if you were transplanting them, in a cell as small as this. In 338 cells here, there's just not a lot of room for something with a big, deep, extensive root system like a cucumber to be able to grow and prosper. And you would be much better off just transplanting out of a larger cell like a 72 size cell, which is a 2-inch cell, or direct selling.